Okay, this is part 2. And we had just talked about the scene where Macbeth is given the prophecies of the witches. And they discuss the prophecies. In scene 4, we go back to the royal court. We're not going to take a look at this right now. But Duncan basically names Malcolm as the heir to the Scottish throne. Now this is important because up until this point, Macbeth could have been named. He was a relative of the king. He could have been named as the next king because in Scotland in this time period, the reign of nobility or the lineage did not depend on whether or not you were born into the royal family. So just because your father was a king did not mean that you would be a king. In this particular situation, however, Duncan does name his son as the heir to his throne and began that whole tradition of parental, the lineage being passed down to the firstborn. Well, when that happens, Macbeth sees that this is an obstacle. He says, this is an obstacle which I must leap over, basically, or else be knocked down. So now this is interesting because at the end of the last scene, Macbeth says he's not going to fret over this prophecy. He says, if chance will have me king, then perhaps chance will crown me without my stir. In other words, I won't have to do anything. I'm just going to leave it alone. But as soon as Malcolm is introduced as the heir, Macbeth begins to talk about, oh wow, I'm not going to be king. So we know that there's something there. There's something that's been awakened in him that is going to cause some problems if he doesn't get it under control. And then we have this whole issue of foreshadowing, because the only way really that Macbeth will ever be king is if he kills anybody who's in his way. If they die. He doesn't have to kill them, I guess, but they have to die, or else he'll never be the king. And fortuitously, the king, Duncan, indicates that he's going to stay at Macbeth's castle that night. Now, Macbeth is still a good man at heart, and he realizes there's a difference between right and wrong. But he still is going to have to struggle to control his ambition, and he is going to lose. The irony of this whole scene is that Duncan's comment at the very beginning that it was impossible to know what someone was thinking, when he talked about the Thane of Cawdor, he said he was a man in whom I had an absolute trust. And yet, I didn't know him at all, basically. The irony here is he also has absolute trust in Macbeth. But he does not know that Macbeth has these thoughts. He's basically saying, false face, hide what the false heart doth know. In other words, let me put this mask on so that the king will never guess that I'm after his throne. Scene 5, we see the birth of Lady Macbeth, and she becomes, in terms of literature, she is one of the great villains, right up there with Cruella de Vil, who killed all the Dalmatians, or who wanted to kill the Dalmatians to make her fur coat. And it begins here in scene 5. When the scene opens, she's reading a letter from Macbeth that informs her of the predictions of the Weird Sisters. And I want you to take a look real quick at that passage from Act 1, Scene 5. So let's just look at it. If we scroll down here to Scene 5, this is the letter she's reading. And he tells her what happened. But look at what he calls her. He says, he says, whilst I stood wrapped in the wonder of it, came missives from the king, and basically telling all this right here. Lay it to thy heart and farewell. She calls her his dearest partner of greatness. So we see that the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is one of equality. He has great respect for her. So here at this quotation mark, his words end and hers began. And she says, Glum as thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised. Yet I do fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. She believes that her husband is too good to do what's going to have to be done. And so she starts to make some decisions about how she's going to help him get what he's been promised. So if we look here, she's reading this letter from Macbeth. She talks about how she wants to pour her spirits in his ears so that he can overcome his nature, which is supposed to be kindness. She finds out that Duncan's staying at the castle that night, and of course she is the first character to actually voice the idea of killing him. And now she's just got to get Macbeth on board with her. In scene 5, she asks the spirits to unsex her, which means it's a reference to her feminine qualities. She wants the spirits to take away those feminine qualities, that anything that might interfere with her plan to murder Duncan. She wants to be like a man. Obviously, men are much crueler than women according to this discussion here. We have here a term, regicide, which means one who kills or helps to kill a king, which is exactly what they're planning to do. Or at least she's planning to do. She's very, her words are ironic because Macbeth is a very brave man. He's a soldier. But she's afraid he's not going to have the nerve to kill the king. It's a different circumstance. There's a huge difference between killing someone in battle and committing cold-blooded murder, and she feels like perhaps she is more suited to that than he is. Which brings us to scene 6. We see Macbeth talking for the first time in his first soliloquy. So let's take a look at that. This is where King Duncan comes. He says, if it were done when 'tis done, 'twere well it were done quickly. In other words, if I could go ahead and get this over with, I would do it. If I could be sure that I wouldn't have to face consequences here in this life, I would go ahead and do this. He says, I'd jump the life to come. In other words, I wouldn't worry about what comes next. I wouldn't worry about being judged by God. But he says, if I do this, we have judgment here. In other words, if I kill him and get caught, I'll have to face judgment here. We teach bloody instructions. In other words, if I kill this king to become the king, then I'm teaching people that if they want to be king, that they'll kill me. And then he begins making this list. He's here in double trust. I'm his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. So here's 2 reasons right here that he should not kill Duncan. He is related to him, and he's also his subject. Duncan is his king. He should be protecting Duncan, not trying to kill him. His host is another 3rd reason. The duties of a host were taken very seriously in this time period. He was supposed to protect people who came to murder the king, not be one of them. And he says, besides this, Duncan has borne his facility so meek, has been so clear in his great office that his virtues would plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. In other words, he's been a good king. He hasn't done anything evil. The people are going to cry out against his murder as being wrongful. So all of these things are on the negative side for why he should not kill Duncan. He says, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. The only thing he has that is an argument to kill Duncan is his ambition. And look at this, what he says to her. Lady Macbeth comes in. He's been thinking about it. He's made a decision. He says, we will proceed no further in this business. So he's back to making a decision saying, we're not going to do this. This is wrong. And then Lady Macbeth goes crazy and begins to berate him. She basically calls him a coward. Let's go back and look at the commentary on that. So he has this inner struggle, and he makes a decision. But she convinces him to commit regicide by insulting his masculinity, by showing her own fierce support, by basically making him feel guilty and telling him that he can't keep his word to her. And then look at what is said here. He goes back and swings the other way, and he says, I am settled. Which means he's going to be a part of killing Duncan. And the last thing he says here is, this is the false face must hide what the false heart does know. He's talking about having to kind of keep this secret. So looking back at the commentary, in Act 7, or Scene 7, she tells Macbeth, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to stab him with these daggers, and we're going to frame the guards for the murder. She's going to get them drunk, and they're going to not be able to have an alibi. And she says, we won't be blamed for it. And when he realizes that he could possibly get away with this, something happens in Macbeth. He shifts. He knows that it's wrong, but he makes a commitment to the plan because he wants to be king. His final line of the scene, false face must hide what the false heart doth know, shows the difference between his face, which is false, and his heart, which is also false. The full title of this play is called The Tragedy of Macbeth, and it shows us that this is a tragedy. And this choice that begins here in this first act goes all the way through Act 5 and is going to end in Macbeth's tragic fall. There's no good reason for him to commit such an act. Duncan's a good man, a good king, but his ambition's in the way. As in many cases, many people commit heinous crimes for small things, whether it's a little bit of power, street credibility, initiation into some gang or club, or for some money to buy some kind of drug. People commit horrible acts for really insignificant things. And so you're going to be doing in your study guide, you need to go back in and fill in the guided note taking, and then you need to work on the activity for dialogue and monologue. There's a difference between dialogue and monologue. Dialogue involves two people speaking back and forth. Monologue involves one person. Generally, in Shakespeare, a monologue is going to be found either in the form of a soliloquy, which is a long speech given by one character on stage by himself or herself, or an aside, which is something that the character says that is not heard by the audience, but reveals the inner thoughts of the character. So that ends our tutorial for Act 1, and I want to thank you. I hope it helped you, and I'll see you later.